and then go directly to our panel, which will be moderated by Doug.
Fantastic. So we stand between you and lunch, I guess, and we have about 45 minutes, or no, I'm sorry, half an hour? Half an hour. Okay, so we will go quickly. We each have deep experience with data harmonization, and we'll try to take just 5 minutes each if we can. So we have a lot of slides, but I wanted to start out. So we're here to contrast the approaches of UC Rex, OMOP, and the PCORnet and NCATS Act. So I'm going to start out talking about the I2B2 part, but overall I want to set the stage that data harmonization is a crucial process for these efforts across organizations. The goal again is reusing clinical data. So I just want to remind people that that all of this is not what the data was originally designed for. When it's clinical data. So there's always going to be some transformation to a new purpose. And then the objective is really to choose a representation that would validly represent the meaning of the original source data, enable accurate aggregation and comparisons across these different sources, and it's always in the context of some specific purpose. So one choice that's great for one thing, like cohort discovery, which has been our focus in UC Rex, might not be a good choice for something that's for adverse drug event or surveillance or comparative effectiveness, and it's just always good to keep that in mind. But the approaches we're going to contrast are the way it's done in I2B2 Shrine. The OMOP is Daniella will talk about, PCORnet Michael will talk about, and I'm sorry, I got that backwards. Michael will talk about OMOP, and Danielle about PCORnet, and then Davera will bring us home with some general considerations. So in I2B2, everything is centered around the ontology. As I mentioned before, it's intended for end user, like researchers, to be able to construct their own queries and get counts back. And then, some in I2B2 you can go a little farther than just counts and get various descriptives. But things are organized in these ontologies. So if you were looking for autistic disorder, it's embedded in this hierarchy, and one selects that particular term. But in I2B2, there's total flexibility in what ontologies you want to set up for your end users. And then that is linked to an underlying data model that's actually a relatively simple data model compared to what you'll hear about from OMOP. There's really only 5 main tables in I2B2 database, and it's really most of the data is in what's called an observation fact table, which is essentially like an entity attribute value table, if people have heard of that, where basically each instead of like having all of your labs in one table, for instance, and all of your vital signs, for example, in a different table, each observation is simply one row in this huge, so each lab value, each vital sign is one row in this big observation fact table, but it's connected to there is a patient dimension, so each patient is uniquely represented in one table, each visit is uniquely represented in another table, so that's how the sort of observations that are from the same encounter or visit can be linked together, but most of the observations are here. And then the one other key thing I wanted to highlight is the concept dimension table. So this is where linkage happens between the concept path, which is in the ontology, to the specific code that's going to represent that in the data. So this establishes a separation. So if you're looking for autism, for instance, in the ontology, this path actually represents all of the steps that you went through. This is the ICD-9 hierarchy as it's represented in our I2B2 instance, actually. And a different I2B2 instance might wind up with a completely different ontology. But when you choose this term, then in this table, it's mapped to this in the source system data, essentially. And so the nice thing about that is then if you want to go to ICD-10, this is the code for ICD-10 for autism, and you can just add another mapping into this table, and then you wind up getting both. So you can represent the source data the way it was originally coded. So if you've switched to ICD-10, but you want your investigators to still search based on ICD-9, you can just put both mappings in here, and then you're going to get back all of the autism patients. And then you can also add another whole tree into the ontology to put in the ICD-10 codes, and so you can have this concept coexisting with this concept in the tree, and the investigator could choose to use either one they want, and you can have both mappings to both concepts so that they would get back all of those results. That is the approach that I think we're planning to take. Now, there's problems with that because there's not always a one-to-one. In the case of autism, there's a nice one-to-one correspondence, but for some proportion, there's not, and then you get into problems potentially where the investigator might not be getting back what they think they're getting back. And I won't go into that any further, but a lot of onus is on the investigator to understand what the underlying data looks like in this situation. The one other thing I was going to mention is that in UC Rex, then we have taken this model of doing our data harmonization, where we start by looking at the source requirements, and so for example, for cohort discovery, if you're talking about race ethnicity. We want to have race ethnicity that the investigators can use to fill out their targeted enrollment table for their grants. So that's a requirement that we come into the game with. And then we always start by looking at what data does each site have. So we do some analysis, then we will propose some data harmonization principles, like the race categories we want to represent are the 5 OMBs, but we also need mixed race, and if we want to fill out the data, the NIH enrollment table, we make a proposal to the executive committee. We do some curation, which and ETL, we deploy it. We do some data quality. We've found in some cases as we've started to do data quality that there's just mistakes made in the ETL, and people are not coded with the right race, and those become apparent when you just look at the distributions, and then we fix those and we go back to the analysis phase. So there's sort of a data harmonization life cycle, even sometimes for one thing like race ethnicity. So I'll stop there. And we'll take questions at the end.
And so I'll give you the same sort of flavor for the OMOP common data model. And so, as was mentioned, this common data model was originally built as a drug adverse event type of data representation, although I think the later versions have been stretching more towards what would be called a comparative effectiveness framework, as they've added more domains and more data framework to try to encompass a larger community and a larger set of use cases. So this is a little bit of a hybrid between, let me just go on to this. So it's really a bit of a hybrid between the entity attribute and the entity relationship model. I'll bounce back and forth a little bit, where you have everything is person-centric, so everything is centered around a given person. And then you have a given set of health system data where you have locations, care sites, organizational level information that really is more about physical location and type of care being delivered within a site that gets represented within the data model in this area. Then, as you would expect with a drug adverse event, CDM, as its inception, it's got very detailed medication exposure information, both at the individual occurrence level, so every time a barcode med admin or an outpatient pharmacy fill record is given, but it also has representations for ERA. So if you're on a medication for a year and a half, and then you stop for 6 months, and then you're on a medication again for another 3 months, that sort of aggregated data, depending on the data rules that you use, can be represented in a derived table, which then speeds up querying and an ability to determine whether someone has an exposure to a given medication at a given time point. So in the same respect, you have all of your administrative codings, conditions that are represented here. And again, you have derived tables that represent acute and chronic illness over time periods that are represented within this type of data, so that you can, again, query for a particular time point look for the existence of acute or chronic illness. So what has happened in the data model is that their catch-all for this CDM is really in the observation table, where laboratory data, vital sign data, and a lot of other characteristics end up being represented within the CDM here. And so again, much as Doug mentioned here, you have to know more of what you're looking for and what you and how to execute your data analysis when you get down into these data types, which are less normalized. And I think the other key in this data model really is that that it does some of its data harmonization by actually bringing together multiple electronic health record source data elements that are common to a domain into one table to allow easier querying for that information. So in this data model, barcode med-admin, CPOE, outpatient pharmacy fill records, administrative codes that actually are relative to drug infusions all get transformed and represented within the medication table, so that you can query one place for exposure to all of it. And the other thing that this common data model does is really require transformation into a key set of common standardized terminologies, so that everyone is supposed to be operating off of these terminologies, which allow for easier distributed queries, where you can build your queries for a set of standard terminologies. They use SNOMED for conditions, LOINC for labs, and RX norms for drugs as examples of the terminologies. And they have a large set of, they use the UMLS a set of standard terminologies to help map non-standard terminologies to these, which allows easier deployment in an individual health system. And so just on the horizon, this is actually the next version that'll be coming out in a few months of the CDM. And what you'll notice here is they've done some expansion to try to address a wider community. They've added medical device exposures. They've separated out labs from observations, because there was a lot of concern in the community that labs didn't have its own representation, because there were some specific issues in labs, like high or low results, things like that really need to be represented with its own table. And some other changes to the terminology mappings.
So although there's a lot of slides in this presentation, it should be really short. So in pScanner, as part of PCORNet, we have adopted the OMOP model for our internal representation, and we are going to map to the PCORNet common data model for our participation in the national network. Our general harmonization process, agnostic to the model, is that we stage the raw data elements and the terminologies into a target in raw data fields. We apply NLM, UMLS standard-to-standard terminology maps to populate standard terminology fields. This is a little bit different from what typically happens in I2B2, where you don't do that standardization until after you've created an ontology. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but the ontology is very much wrapped into the model that we're using in pScanner. And then once you have that staging done, you can fill in the gaps in the terminology mapping that are not taken care of by UMLS metathesaurus tools. In that case, you would prioritize by a given use case and retain any of your resolved maps and reuse them across the network as needed. And then finally, you have a quality assessment and monitoring. Our data sources are constantly refreshing, and as we found in some of the projects that Jason is going to talk about today, there's new terminologies that come up, there's weird things that happen over the course in time, and so the quality assessment and monitoring is something that means we have to update our programs all the time. So this is the PecorNet CDM for version 1, and the fields that we have are demographics, enrollment, which is something that is potentially a carryover from a very claims-based approach to looking at the world. So we're working actively within PecorNet to try to figure out whether and how we represent enrollment in places where you have a fee-for-service EHR that's not part of something like an HMO. The encounter, the diagnosis, the procedures, and a set of vital signs. So this is a pretty achievable group of things for us to tackle in this first phase. As a group, there's a subset of us that are also working on what might be available in the next phase and how we would revise this in the PCORI Common Data Model Working Group. I'm going to just go through how many additional things that we've just discussed very quickly. So one of the nice things that the coordinating center did was to take each one of the new things that have come up as potential data domains that we might want to work on and develop a taxonomy or a categorization of the level of effort, the utility, and the difficulty for standardizing and managing the data into something that's useful. So for things that are going to be very difficult to standardize, maybe we just stuff them into the model in their raw format and worry later about trying to get those kinds of mappings done on a use case by use case basis. So an investigator that is starting a new project may say, oh, I'm going to really create the map that I need and share it back to the network for doing a very specific set of microbiology classifications. So yeah, sorry, just going through all of these different. Okay, so I think that another thing that has really come up is, how do these different data models all fit into the universe of other data models, especially when you're thinking about HL7, you have this reference information model that is far too detailed to really actually achieve the utility that you need. So we take these models at different levels as per the use case, which is how Doug kind of introduced this. So it's not really clear what the exact right level is, but we can look at some of the things that we have been tried in the operational community between the vendors, ONC and CMS. And so you have the CDA, the quality data model, and the continuity of care document that are part of basically operational standards. You have a number of research based standards. OMOP, the virtual data warehouse, we don't have a representation for VDW, but it's not too different from Mini Sentinel. And then the evolving PecorNet common data model. I think in conclusion, I would say that the history of these different models is actually somewhat aligned. So OMOP and PecorNet both derived from the Mini Sentinel data model in the universe where they were expecting to look at claims data for adverse event surveillance. They both evolved over time with different kinds of user communities and seem to be somewhat converging. I2B2 was meant for cohort discovery and supporting different kinds of clinical trials and has a different approach from either of these two models. The one thing that they have in common is this concept table that Doug was talking about that represents the way that you would traverse an ontology in order to capture different kinds of variables and data sets. OMOP also has something that they call the vocabulary table, which is, I think, 7 tables of relational databases that allow you to do that same kind of traversal that captures the whole UMLS relationships. And it does some of the source to concept mapping as well as the hierarchical mappings that you might get in creating these kinds of variables. So it may be that we're approaching some kind of convergence as well across these different systems. And I think that Davera can kind of talk about whether or not the level of effort and different kinds of gotchas are going to be worth it over time.
Advancing the slides is up. Okay. Hi, everybody. I want to thank, because this is the first time I've been at the podium, I want to thank Lucilla for inviting me to come speak. And I also want to acknowledge Mike Hogarth and his encouragement for me over the years. And in particular, I'm embracing what Mike has referred to me as the intrepid semanticist. So I stand here before you today as the intrepid semanticist, and in 5 minutes, I'm going to give you the high-level bullets of 7 years of data harmonization, both in the CICTR project as well as UC Rex. You ready? Okay, we're going to slide right on into lunch here, guys. Okay, oh, no, that's not my slide. Okay, first of all, this is an excerpt from our AMIA poster from the joint summits from last spring. These are the highlights of kind of the things that we've learned doing data harmonization UC Rex. First of all, we, as Doug talked about, we have a collaborative governance process. It's iterative. We can make mistakes and then discover that and come back to it. We like that. We understand our requirements and our source data, and we do those evaluations in our analyses. We manage scope and expectations, and one of the things that's great about UC Rex, at least initially, was that our use case was to boil the ocean. Okay, we had to get as much data up as possible, and so that actually gave us some leeway to scope out some things that were too difficult. You don't always have that leeway in other projects, but that's something that's actually been a pretty good principle for us. If we get into the analysis and it's just going to be too much for us to stay with our, within our delivery time frame of in a year, we table that, we record what learnings we have, and we move on. So, for example, we did that with microbiology, and we're going to come back to that this year, probably. The other thing is that we want to be really careful about conflating the definitions. We have all these divergent systems, models, definitions, etc. We will conflate, but we conflate with care. And what we mean by that is that if we have something that has more specificity and we've got to put it in a bigger bucket with some other dissimilar things because it fits our use case, we'll do that, but we understand that, and we do that carefully. And then what we don't do is we don't create data. In the same process, sometimes people we want to call things that they weren't in their source system. So an example of that is we struggled a little bit with, I'll talk about this in a minute, in race and ethnicity with regards to Hispanic and non-Hispanics. One of the things that one of our technicians wanted to do, but we decided it wasn't a good idea, is we decided if we didn't have a value for non-Hispanic, if we didn't have a value for Hispanics, that maybe all of those people are Caucasian. Okay. Now that was a conclusion that an individual made, but that's a pretty extreme example. But that's an example of creating data. So we don't do that. Okay, I'm not going fast enough. I got to talk faster. Okay. Global considerations. Okay, something you want to think about when you're doing this kind of work is that there's many flavors of null. There's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of information actually at HL7 about flavors of null. They've got some pretty good definitions, but what that means is sometimes you have a true null, meaning there's no data. Sometimes it's a value like patient refused. Sometimes it's, maybe your value is 0, which is not null. So what you got to do is be aware of your flavors of null. There's sometimes, and Doug alluded to this, sometimes there's multiple values per patient per encounter. You got to make decisions about it. You taking all that? You taking the first one? You taking the last one? Which one are you taking? You want to be mindful that you might include or exclude sources, certain source data. That it's okay to exclude some source data if you think it's going to affect your definitions or your data quality and it doesn't affect your overall program. You want to take a look at date stamps to see if you want to include date and time with that. Another consideration that we've had, and we'll talk about this in a minute, is having to do with a birth date is not an age. They're not the same thing. There's also variations in our data with regards to choices in implementation. Epic, for example, is an extremely flexible system. That's great because it gives you lots of options. Creates problems, though, sometimes on the back end as to the context or where your data ends up. Another example of that is that we did some work in UC Rex on encounter type. How many encounter types do we have?
60.
60 encounter types. So with 60 encounter types, then that's really tough on the back end if you don't know what the context was or the reason that you had those 60 different encounter types. Some of them are administrative, but it definitely affects the semantics in the data. And then the other thing to be aware of is sometimes you have one EMR that you're getting your data from, and sometimes you have a bunch. How many do we have at UCSF? How many systems, Doug? 2? 3 historically, yeah. So I know that sometimes Dana at UCSF has some challenges because he has different systems. So those are just some global considerations. Now I'm going to run rapidly through some data classes and just tell you what some highlights are about some things you might think about. Okay, first of all, sex. We took a look at the HL7 tables, and they have great wisdom there. I think that sex typically is really administrative gender, and it does not include things in your value set like not nearly enough or only if I have to. We also so what that really means is we're talking about gender. It is typically used to room people. It's not at all biologic sex. So you need to make a distinction whether you have something that is a biologic indicator or whether it's kind of a social indicator. Okay, typically we have social indicators. We had to talk about transgender folks and how and we would represent those, and then we also, which is also obviously different than people who are biologically true hermaphrodites. Age. Your date-time format factors into this. We're running into this at NCATS right now, given that we are looking at pediatric populations, and they, in some cases, age, it's good to roll up to like an even year, so we know so your birth date is at a certain point in the year, and you roll up to the year. Sometimes you want to know days or months, so that's a consideration in particular with pediatric populations. You've heard lots about how our obfuscation strategies. You might want to think about, whether or not you're obfuscating the elderly. The other thing that we thought about in our I2B2 implementations is whether to represent single years or to have folders with ranges and what those ranges look like for your end users. And then the other thing, a subtle thing, is that there's a real difference between your present age and age at encounter, and that would be handled differently. Race and ethnicity, there's a lot of information about this in our poster from Amy last year at the joint summits. But fundamentally, there's two ways that you can collect this data per the government. They're not equal. They're very difficult to tease out, and particularly when it comes to when you split out ethnicity and you have Hispanics and non-Hispanics. What do you do? How do you handle the nulls when you don't have one kind of record but you have this record? It's really kind of a gnarly problem. Lab results. Most of your lab results are in a very small number of labs. So your volume transaction is in a very small number, okay? So we have about 100 of the top tests. And there was some variation across our sites, but for the most part, that got a huge number of our overall lab results transactions. Units of measure, you got to look at all of those in detail. Across the 5 UC sites, we had different units of measure. Those have to be normalized. LOINC is a great coding system. It's very specific. It's a little too specific to use that for the nodes in an I2B2 in an I2B2 instance. Also, typically, because of the method access, you're not going to get a one-to-one, across multiple sites or even maybe across multiple labs. So LOINC is great. It's got some challenges with it. Textual results, you have to come up with value sets to represent the values in those. Often there's misspellings and whatnot. And so the example of that, like if you have a list of colors for urine or something like that, you'd be surprised how many ways people spell those, and the variety between various sites. So your textual results need to be normalized to a value set. And as I mentioned before, microbiology is a very important but different animal. It takes a lot more detail, and we're going to get to that this year. Diagnosis. We have different kinds of diagnosis types: admitting, discharge. Sometimes your admitting is actually conflated with other values such as reason for visit. Sometimes diagnoses come from a problem list. And then even if you just use billing diagnosis, sometimes you have a primary diagnosis versus secondary diagnoses. One of the problems you have with ICD-9 and with the CMS rules for billing is sometimes you might miss something subtle. So the example is somebody will have a discharge diagnosis of diabetes mellitus if they were admitted to the hospital for something, say, having to do with their foot, the diabetic foot. Even the diabetic foot was the problem. If you're interested in diabetic feet, you may not actually get to that level of specificity in your diagnosis when you do your query. So it's something to be aware of, primary versus other diagnoses. And then Doug talked a little bit about I-10 and the necessity that we're going to have to start doing crosswalks or perhaps synonymy, other things that are available to do the to do the crosswalks. Medications, all of our sites I would imagine all of our sites have proprietary content from one of the big pharmacy vendors. The issues that we came up in working on medications had to do with what do you do with combination drugs? How do you represent those? How do you represent dose forms, different dose forms, or do you? What do you do about administration strength? Are we interested in that? And are we looking at instead of a strength of a single dose, maybe the lifetime or the episodic dose of a particular drug? One of the things I want to acknowledge is Ayan Patel, who's sitting back there, has done an amazing job, and look out for they haven't accepted it, we don't have it in yet, but he's done an amazing job coming up with a set of algorithms to map all of the UC Rex medications all the way to an RX norm code. That was challenging. So what he did is a series of queries and used different sorts of RX norm term types then to drive all the way to a semantic clinical drug, the SCD term type. So if you're struggling with medications right now, I would talk to that guy because he's the expert on that. He's done a really great job with that. One of the things that he did is that we kept looking at to see if we could map directly to RX norm codes, and what we did is we utilized the NDC 11-digit code to drive to that semantic clinical drug. Okay, I know I took more than 5 minutes, but I think that's everything. Thanks.
So we could 10 minutes for questions. Fantastic. So go ahead, Mike Hogarth.
Wait for the mic.
Okay.
I just can't pass up the opportunity as the nation's informortician to talk about vital status.
Dr. Hogarth.
So maybe you can talk about vital status because it's an important part of the data sets because it actually will change the denominator. You know, if you're including women who are deceased in your mammography screening, colon cancer screening, that's a problem. So maybe you can comment on how we might be addressing that and some of the challenges actually nationally with that.
Okay, so the question was how do we address vital status and get more complete data, I think is what you're saying, because we certainly have very incomplete data. Most people don't die in the hospital, or at least in our hospital. So we're not. Yeah, they never die in our hospital, but if people die at home or they are often taken to the nearest emergency room. So even if they've been our patient over a long period of time,
They die
they
in Sutter. Right.
Yes.
Right.
So anyway, the potential would be to link to national, or especially in California, the California Electronic Death Registry system, which Dr. Hogarth is actually in charge of the technology for anyway. So we've been talking about that, and there's some challenges in terms of matching the patient identities and how that would all the data that we have in those dedicated databases that I showed you is actually de-identified. So we'd have to have some kind of process for. And we've talked about implementing something that would connect to EDRS web service, but I'm not sure where that stands actually. Do you want to?
Well, I'll mention something about that actually. So we have the okay to do it. We're actually going to work with the legislature to change the statute so it allows it to be used for quality improvement here in California, but it's a constant challenge across the country. And that would not include individuals who unfortunately passed away on a trip or outside of California. So the National Death Index, or NDI, is a nice source, but it's not available for this kind of thing. So that probably needs to change and may require Congress to actually act to do that. And some, I think, a really important component of some of the things that we're talking about here. The other thing I'll just mention is many of you should probably try this query. It's just for those that you do have a deceased flag for, try to identify their date of death. So we did that in our database, and we found that 26,000 people died January 1st, 1980. So obviously that's not correct, but sometimes data migrations from older systems will cause an issue, and they'll just they'll create data, as I think Davera was mentioning. So I would really encourage people, again, as the infomortician and vital records person, to really do a histogram of date of birth as well as date of death on your data sets as a way of profiling for data quality around the vital status.
Could I also add that on vital status, and I didn't mention that, and it should have been one of my slides. Logically, the only thing we can know is known deceased, and we've talked about that a lot in in ACTS. So you can't know that someone's still alive. I mean, not really, not in your data. You hope they are, but the only way you can, if you have a flag, the only thing that you can say is that they're known deceased. You have to make assumptions that, everybody else might still be kicking. So that's a little subtle thing.
Yeah, and I would just add, for the VA, we're in a bit of an advantaged position because we can link both the inpatient and outpatient records, the Veterans Benefits system, as well as the National Death Index that all gets integrated into, and Medicare data that all gets integrated into the repository. So we'll be including that in our installation.
Yeah, if you need the right contact to how to get the deal with the NDI with the healthcare system so you can use it for that, we'd be happy to help.
Okay.
But I want to ask a much easier question. Besides talking with this guy in the back of the room, how do you tackle some of these data standardization and mapping issues so you can use these great models? And this is something we're knee-deep in, so I thought maybe if you had some suggestions from your other side.
How do we tackle them? So, could you elaborate a little bit? How do we tackle it so we can use them?
Yeah, so to use I2B2, you've got to have a concept mapped. To use OMOP, you've got to have something in the vocabulary table and this standard thing. At the VA, we have 130 hospitals, more than 1,400 points of care, 800 outpatient clinics, and they all code things a little differently or use local codes. So what would your advice be to somebody who's getting into this arena on how you tackle the data standardization and mapping so that you can put it in these models and use these tools?
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to distribute that down somewhat. I think, we have the advantage of just having 5 right now, so everyone has an equal say. We analyze, what are the local variances in a particular value, and then, we also have the luxury of choosing something that we think investigators will want. So, for instance, we were looking at vital signs. We did find some differences among different, slight differences. Most of us have EPIC, and so actually that imposed some standardization. But we chose to represent, like, weight, for instance, in pounds, because we just thought that investigators would. Although that was, a little bit of a questionable thing, but we chose to do that, and that is the way it shows up in EPIC. So we thought they would be used to that. But that's just an arbitrary decision that we made, and we had the ability to. If you have a lot of organizations, then probably things have to be imposed. And in OMOP, there's it does impose. It has its built-in transformation program, so it's trying to impose a standardization, but there still might be things that don't map, values that don't map, so the local analysis will have to be done. Mike, do you want to elaborate?
I was going to say it's going to be, even in the lab data, as you have even in the top 10, top 20 lab, you have complete punch outs for some sites where they just didn't submit any lab data, or they didn't submit lab data. So I think there's going to be, an ongoing iterative process for data quality assessments across each of the domains. It's going to be almost never-ending, process to try to maintain good data quality.
Any suggestions other than going through them one by one and marking them off the list?
Well, I have kind of a reductionist perspective on this, in that you've got your source data and you've got your target requirements. And there's some things in the target systems, like in OMOP or in some of the VA systems, that constrain all that, so you understand your requirements. What we did in UC Rex is go class by class, and when things got too difficult or too hard for us to keep with our timeline, we reduced those out. But really, it seems like it's huge and complicated. It's really just your source data and the target requirements, and then making your source data fit into the target. And I know that sounds really, really easy, and there's tons of maps and everything out there. But at UC Rex, what we did is that we had 5 sites. We worked on it together year over year. And if we add other nodes now, we're not going to go back and discuss how we did age or diagnosis with those other sites. We're going to use what we already accomplished. So it does seem daunting. There's a lot to do, but really, you have to understand the context of your source data. That's really hard, okay? And then map those or use available maps to get it into your target format. It's really very simple. There's really only 3 parts.
So I think because you're asking this question, I'm going to float some ideas that are not very well fleshed out. But there's 2 sources of information that we might not leverage as much as we would like to. One is taking some of the similar kinds of algorithms that we'd use in semantic analysis and natural language processing to try to figure out if there's a way to automate some mapping or a provisional map that's based on some other content. The other, in terms of identifying the context of the data in order to give you some breadcrumbs or clues along that, is to look at the audit log, which gets sort of like the vital sign for your EHR. You can see what's happening transactionally, when it's happening, how it's coordinated with other data sources. That's actually really big data compared to everything else in the record. So I would put that out there as possibilities. I don't know if anybody has done anything like that.
Well, I would add a corollary to that Martin, I'm trying to remember his last name. He's on the OMOP team at J&J. He actually built an NLP tool to basically take the UMLS representation and the OMOP standard terminology set and look at your descriptions of your native source data and try to match based on the terminology names so that you could do mapping for previously unmapped concepts. So there are some tools out there to help with the ETL process for various terminologies.
I'll throw in one other thing, which is there's in OMOP there's Oscar and Grouch apparently, which are these automated things, and then what I've heard is that there's Achilles is kind of a new generation of that does some automated data quality analyses on just the data. I think without really knowing too much about it, but just looks for I think outliers and things like that are statistically odd.
Thanks.
Great. One more question?
Well, the question is short, but the answer may not be.
Which then we might leave for later, but...
So I was just wondering if there is anything in terms of a collaborative space for any need for reference data sets, maybe in the OMOP, I2B2, and maybe the virtual data warehouse or the P-coordinate represented there so that we can compare different tools or build new tools. Do you see any value doing that from a funding agency?
Yeah, that's certainly come up in a lot of our collaborative discussions, is trying to have a sandbox that, if not with real data, some synthetic data in these different formats that we could use to drive different application development, whether it's visualization or data quality assessment. A lot of times some barriers to development are occurring because people don't have their own, their sandbox to play with data. The other collaborative activity, not to ramble on too much, but I think that what we're finding with the PCORNet project is that there's a lot of people that are trying to do this independently and doing a lot of redundant work. And so as this has gone on, we're finally coming together and realizing, we can actually borrow each other's code, share things across sites. Sometimes it's just a snippet with this Clarity instance and this other Clarity instance. Sometimes it's a full transformation. And that's unfunded work right now that we're doing across the different CDRNs. And it would be very helpful if PCORI would help us with a collaboration infrastructure, whether it's a repository for version control or some other approach that would enable us to do this and fund people to do it. I think that, it's not free to do this kind of thing, but the value added, I think, is pretty high.
May I just add that I think we are not only creating redundant systems, but sometimes sticking to one because it was created here, and then the not created here is an issue. So whatever project or large initiative that sticks to just one thing, I think is not going to encompass a large community. We did start with some particular tool, and as we evolve in UC Rex, we see other alternatives, and we see how to combine things. And I think that's the value of it. The reason I wanted to have everyone from the two projects mixed up together is because these things are hard, and they might not be well understood how much time it takes to do all this stuff, because in the end, you want the fancy graphical user interface with the analytics and the graphs there. But what's behind the scenes is what these folks are doing and have been doing for a long time. And I think that deserves a lot of thought. So lastly, I just wanted to say, the other day I had this quest to find what's the prognosis of a brain tumor type, astrocytoma grade 2. I need to find it. And I have 21 million records that I could potentially look into. It's not easy. I'm not going to find that answer, without a whole lot of effort. And so the big vision here is that we should be able to find, and across the 11 networks, and we should say, if you have state-of-the-art treatment, that's what it's happening right now. So it's well beyond even finding the appropriate clinical trial or the newest therapy, is even finding what's happening right now across the systems. We can't do it, and it's terribly embarrassing, I think, for our profession to be in that shape. But that's what folks like this are working towards. So I want to thank the panel once again